we are not going to get through this chapter today. We're getting really close to the end of our study, and we're on chapter 15 out of 16, well, 17 if you want to count sort of the final concluding chapter. So we're getting real close to the end, so we're starting to tie a lot of these threads together that we've been talking about. And of course, last week we talked about sacred space, holy place, where we're gathered, baptism of spiritual warfare, things like that. That was where we were, and that bleeds into this chapter because we've gotten to a place now in the story where we've got to leave sort of present and past behind. We've got to start looking to the future. What does all of these different threads that we've pulled on, where do they lead to in the future? And it really is a question of who we are, because we are in the world and not of the world. We've talked about that recently. And we say things like that, and we talk about saved by grace through faith, and it's sort of as a defining characteristic of who we are as Christians. But that's just real surface level stuff. If you go back and you look at the studies we've done and see God's original plan, he had this idea for his human family and his divine family to be working together and interacting and doing all that. And that's what his plans for us are, and that's the whole thrust of trying to spread Eden around the world and then trying to recreate Eden on earth, which is sort of the picture we get at the end of the book. And so at some level, we are going to be like his divine creation, not just his human creation. John mentions this. See what kind of love the Father has given to us, that we should be called children of God, and so we are. The reason why the world does not know us is that it did not know him. Beloved, we are God's children now, and what we will be has not yet appeared. But we know that when he appears, we will be like him, because we shall see him as he is, and everyone who thus hopes in him purifies himself as he is pure. He says when we see Jesus, when he comes back, we're going to be like him. And of course you can read the end of the Gospels where Jesus shows up and he does things like walk through walls and appear and disappear, and people don't recognize him, and then all of a sudden they do recognize him. So there's something different about him that it's not quite human. There's something more there. And John says, we're going to be like that. Okay, now, what is that? The word that is sometimes used in commentary, stuff like that, is the word glorification. We will be glorified. We will be made like him. And again, it's trying to capture this idea in a word. 2 Peter chapter 1. I'm going to go up and start in verse 3. His divine power has granted to us all things that pertain to life and godliness, through the knowledge of him who called us to his own glory and excellence, by which he has granted to us his precious and very great promises, so that through them you may become partakers of the divine nature, having escaped from the corruption that is in the world because of sinful desire. We will be partakers of divinity. So it's not just human, it's human and divine. That's where we're headed. And of course, we just read the passage in John where he says that's what we are. And so that sort of sets the stage for where we're headed. Okay, this is just our outline. Let's get past that. Okay. The story starts, and we know this. This is still a little bit of recap. The story starts with failure. We didn't do Eden the way we were supposed to. We did not successfully serve as God's imagers the way he intended us to. When God gives mankind a second chance after the flood, you go and you read God's command, and it's a reiteration of what he told Adam and Eve in Eden, and they're supposed to take the knowledge of God throughout the world, and that doesn't happen, and then you get the Babel event, and then there's Israel, and that's God's section, and he sort of forgoes everyone else. He says, I'm going to work with Israel. And even Israel doesn't do their job of drawing people back to the true God. And of course, that's the story we get at the beginning of Genesis 12, where God calls one guy, Abram, or Abraham eventually, and his job is, through Abraham, he is going to reintroduce himself to the world. He says it like this, and I think we even come back to this verse later on. Lord said to Abram, go from your country, your kindred, your father's house, to the land I will show you. I will make you a great nation. I will bless you and make your name great, so that you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and him who dishonors you I will curse. And in you all families of the earth will be blessed. Now, this is immediately post-Babel, where God divided the world up. And we know from our readings that he sort of said, okay, I'm not dealing with those people anymore. They're sort of out there. I'm going to let these other spiritual beings sort of rule over them. They're supposed to do it my way, but they're in charge of that. But here he says all of these families are going to be blessed because of what I'm doing in Abraham. And Israel doesn't do it. They don't get it right. They follow God, when it's convenient. I was talking to Cindy yesterday. She said, how is it that Israel keeps wandering away? And I said, Israel wanders away the same way we wander away. We're going this direction, all of a sudden we're like, ooh, shiny. Every time they saw a new statue of Baal, Israel's sort of wandering off, ooh, shiny. They're human. They got distracted just like we do. But salvation is still going to come through Israel. There's one guy that's going to do it. God himself is going to become not just a man, but an Israelite. And so through what Jesus does, God is going to gather all of the nations of Babel and bring them back into relationship with him. Ephesians chapter 3, beginning in verse 3. Paul says, the mystery was made known to me by revelation, as I've briefly written. When you read this, you can perceive my insight into the mystery of Christ, which was not made known to the sons of men in other generations, as it has now been revealed to his holy apostles and prophets by the Spirit. The mystery is that the Gentiles are fellow heirs, members of the same body, partakers of the promise in Jesus Christ, through the gospel. That promise given to Abraham, that all families of the earth were going to be blessed. Paul says here in Ephesians, here's the mystery. The Gentiles get it too. And so it's God reunifying, bringing back together all of the nations that were scattered at Babel. Paul talks about this in Galatians as well. But now that faith has come, we're no longer under a guardian, for in Christ Jesus you are all sons of God through faith. For as many of you as were baptized into Christ have put on Christ. There's neither Jew nor Greek, neither slave nor free, nor male nor female, for all are one in Christ Jesus. And if you are Christ, then you are Abraham's offspring, heirs according to the promise. Again, all the way back to Genesis 12. And the reference to baptism here, remember our discussion, was it last week, about baptism? How baptism is spiritual warfare because it is a proclamation of Christ's victory over the forces of evil. Remember I said that when Jesus goes to Mount Hermon and there's the transfiguration, all that kind of stuff, I said he went to pick a fight. Baptism is kind of the same thing. It's us standing up and saying, this is whose side I'm on. If that's not picking a fight in a spiritual sense, I don't know what is. But Paul is saying here, that makes us heirs to the promise. That's how God is working out this promise in the world. Now, just to recap, we know all this. Non-Israelites, they're living under the control, under the dominion, under the power of these lesser gods. And gods there specifically with a lowercase g. And almost exclusively in the Old Testament, these areas outside of God's sacred space, God's holy place, Israel, they're almost always referred to geographically. There are regions that these other entities control. New Testament sort of lumps all that together and just calls them Gentiles, but it's all about kingdom and authority and power of these foreign deities. And so, again, think back to our study of sacred space and God's place versus not God's place. And then yet someone from God's people, a descendant of Abraham, comes and he died and then he rose, but he didn't just do it for the Jews. He did it for all of those Gentiles out there. Again, God is reclaiming the nations. Paul calls this the mystery, the passage that we just read. So how does that play out? Well, let's look at some verses here. Because it's not, again, just for Israel. John chapter 1, verse 12. But to all who did receive him, who believed in his name, he gave the right to become children of God. Children of God, the people who are now under the dominion of Yahweh, are those who choose it. It's not DNA anymore, it's faith. We read Galatians 3:26, for in Christ Jesus all are sons of God through faith. Romans chapter 8. For all who are led by the Spirit of God are the sons of God. So you get in the Old Testament this discussion of nations that is all about kingdom and authority and dominion and stuff like that. In the New Testament, you start getting God's authority, God's dominion, and it's based on faith, and then all of that is done in terms of family. Did you notice how the passages always refer to Christians? Sons of God, we're adopted into the family of God, we are heirs. The New Testament is all about family language. Continuing in Romans 8, verse 15. For you did not receive the spirit of slavery to fall back into fear, but as you've received the spirit of adoption as sons, by whom we cry, Abba, Father. It's God bringing people back into his family. It is the fulfillment of that promise that was made right after Babel when he called Abraham. So God is still working out that ancient promise. Verse 23. Did I write? Yeah, I wrote it down. Verse 23. Not only the creation, but we ourselves, who have the first fruits of the Spirit, groan inwardly as we wait eagerly for adoption as sons, for the redemption of our bodies. Ephesians 1. He predestined us for adoption as sons through Jesus Christ, according to the purpose of his will. Again, it's family language. It's God bringing everyone back to where, in all fairness, we should have been in the first place. And so this inheritance language tells us not only who we are, but whose we are. It's all about being part of God's divine family. how did I phrase up there? Our destiny, God's original intent. You go back and read Eden before the fall, where people were living in the presence of God. God's walking around talking to them. That's what he wants. That's the relationship he wants with us. He wants us to be his imagers, bearing within our very nature the picture of God and doing God things. And so that is the fulfillment of the promise. And then, of course, you have to throw in the commercial line. But wait, there's more. Buy now and you also get a 3-pack of Ginsu knives or something. There is more than just God fulfilling his promise. We now need to go and look and see how is it that Jesus describes us. Let's go to Hebrews. Hebrews chapters 1 and 2. It's cool stuff here. Let's talk about Jesus for just a second. Having become as much superior to the angels as the name he has inherited is more excellent than theirs. And so Jesus, the way he existed in heaven is, the text says, superior to the angels. Now, how do you describe superior? He outranks them. He's more glorious than them. He's more powerful than however you want to fill in that blank, feel free. I doubt you're going to mess that one up because he is a level above. He's a order of magnitude greater than they are. But chapter 2, beginning in verse 6. It's been testified somewhere, what is man that you are mindful of him, or the son of man that you care for him? You made him for a little while lower than the angels. You've crowned him with glory and honor, putting everything in subjection under his feet. So, Jesus was greater than them, and then for a while, he's made lower. And you say, why? What's the point? What's the result of that? And we say salvation. That's the word that we use. What's the result of Jesus coming down and then going back up? And we say, well, it's salvation. But that really doesn't even capture the whole essence of what's going on. Because Jesus became mortal, that means we as mortals have the option of becoming divine. Again, it's back to members of God's family, and that's the way Jesus describes us. Chapter 2, verse 10. For it was fitting that he, for whom and by whom all things exist, in bringing many sons to glory, should make the founder of their salvation perfect through suffering. For he who sanctifies and those who are sanctified all have one source. That is why he is not ashamed to call them brothers, saying, I will tell of your name to my brothers. In the midst of the congregation, I will sing your praise. And again, I will put my trust in him. And again, behold, I and the children God has given me. There will come a time when Jesus will stand, the text says, in the midst of the congregation and introduce us as his brothers and sisters. And then I look at this and I go, wait a minute. Who's he introducing us to? Who is this congregation or this assembly or this council? Well, think about the study that we've had up until this point. God has these other spiritual beings that serve him, that surround him, that work with him. That's his council. That's who we're being presented to. We're going to do a real quick sidebar here. Okay, we're going to finish up on a sidebar here because we're not going to get done today. Go over to Revelation chapter 4. Yeah, I know, Revelation. Hard to understand. Bizarre imagery. Pictures that we don't get. Okay. But I think this one's fairly easy because you get a picture of what's going on in heaven. After this is chapter 4. After this, I looked and behold, a door standing open in heaven. And the first voice, which I had heard speaking to me like a trumpet, said, "Come up here, and I will show you what must take place after this." At once I was in the Spirit, and behold, a throne stood in heaven, and one seated on the throne. I like that. God on his throne in heaven. And he who sat there had the appearance of jasper and carnelian, and around the throne was a rainbow that had the appearance of emerald. Around the throne were 24 thrones, and seated on the thrones were 24 elders, clothed in white garments. Do you see the divine council here? God and his other spiritual beings are there. With crowns on their heads. From the throne came flashes of lightning, rumbling, peals of thunder, and before the throne were burning 7 torches of fire. Okay, you get this idea of what's going on here. But these aren't angels. These people gathered around, or these beings gathered around God, are not angels. And we know that because if you look down in verse 11. Oh, chapter 5:11. My bad. I was looking at 4:11 going, I think the verse I remember. Okay, chapter 5:11. Then I looked, and around the throne and the living creatures and the elders, and I heard around the throne and the living creatures and the elders the voice of many angels. Around these elders on their thrones, he heard the voice of angels. So they're not angels. What are they? Well, apparently from the description, they are at some level people. But at some level, they are divine. Because they're on God's counsel. They're serving God. They're gathered around him in this assembly. Which throws us back now to Hebrews chapter 2. I will tell of your name to my brothers in the midst of the congregation, in the middle of the assembly, I will sing praise. Jesus' reaction is not some version of shame at having been made lower. He didn't see this as a punishment, as an exile. Rather, he comes to gather us and take us back into heaven to present to God's counsel as his brothers, which kind of puts us on a level similar to where he is, certainly above the angels. Paul describes this. Romans 8. We'll probably end with this, with a couple of verses here. Romans 8, beginning in verse 18. I consider that the sufferings of this present time are not worth comparing with the glory that is to be revealed in us. For the creation waits with eager longing for the revealing of the sons of God. For creation was subjected to futility, not willingly, but because of him who subjected it, in hope that creation itself will be set free from its bondage to corruption and obtain the freedom of the glory of the children of God. For we know the whole creation has been groaning together in the pains of childbirth until now, and not only creation, but we ourselves. And that's where he lost his place. And not only creation, but we ourselves, who have the first fruits of the Spirit, groan inwardly as we wait eagerly for our adoption as sons, the redemption of our bodies. This speaks to our fate of being brought into the family of God. Now, there's some other passages here. I want to read them, but we don't have time to do them all justice today, so I'm actually going to stop right here today. Yeah, I know we didn't get through the whole chapter, but that's okay. I've also got technical issues that I'm fighting up here this morning, and so I've got to work on that a little bit. So we're going to cut off class just a couple minutes early. Questions or comments? I know this chapter is deep, but it's pulling together a lot of threads that we've been playing with for a while. So we'll pick up here next week.